Welcome everyone, we're back with another Infernalist build guide. So, no longer are we dabbling around with demon form, but we've found something else to play with. This specifically is an Infernalist crypt-based Detonate Dead build. And, well, as you could see, it specializes in bossing, but it also functions quite well in mapping and works quite good as an all-round build. For those of you that haven't seen my videos before, I do like to dive quite deep into the details, and I do have this Google Spreadsheet available, which will both serve as a bit of a transcript for myself or a script to follow and help me out, but I also do find viewers like to have a written form to cross-reference and keep for themselves as well. So I will be sharing that publicly and link it in the video at the end as well. I will preface straight away, this build is not cheap. It is definitely in the upper tiers cost-wise. I would consider it sort of upper mid-tier. We're not talking about mirror levels of craziness here, but for reference, my setup cost, I think, within the range of about 75 divs. I set myself a bit of a budget. I wanted to get under 100 and landed there. That said, before I did make the build, I did do a 1 div entry level setup, basically just to sample the build and see if I liked it before investing my currency into the proper setup, see if my ideas actually worked as well. But that said, the build does have a lot of room to grow if you are in that top percentile and do have crazy amounts of currency. Anyway, the build, the key pillars center around Detonate Dead, using the sacrifice spirit aura to be able to use that on your own minions. We use mind over matter to basically use mana as our HP pool. That synchronizes well with Archmage, which basically more mana, more damage. We use Eldritch Battery in combination with Chaos Inoculation, so we don't run any HP or ES, the reasons for which we'll dive into a bit later. One of the key ascendancy nodes, two that we center around are Grinning Immolation for more crit damage, hence it being a crit build, and Altered Flesh, which serves as quite a very strong defensive layer. We also stack a lot of Spirit. More Spirit is more minions, and there's also a unique focus that you can run, which also makes Spirit mean you have more spell damage, but again, we'll dive into the details a bit later. As I said, I'll kind of just touch upon in that quick run through, there are a lot of nice synergies between all the various components of the build, and we'll cover those in more detail throughout the video. Bit of background as to why I landed on this build. I've been an Infernalist since launch. I really did spend a lot of time centered around demon form orientated builds, but quite simply got bored of them. The other common builds running around, minions, don't interest me in terms of using minions as your source of damage in terms of them doing all the damage. So this is a bit of a spin. You know, we are a minion build, but we're the ones killing the minions. So yeah, bit different. But basically, after Demon 4, gravitated to a lot of Spark, Archmage type builds, simply the flavour of the month, very meta, and it was just very good for efficiency and farming currency. Been sitting on the idea, really wanting to try and do something around Grinning Immolation in combination with Eldritch Battery and Chaos Inoculation for a while, but after struggling to find something that works, using Comet, all sorts of cast on, abilities. Nothing really felt quite right. It was always kind of felt like I was, fighting against the grain a little bit. So ultimately, a couple of days ago, I came across, shout out here, or give credit where credit's due, a video of Cripps, who I believe got his idea from DS Lily. Both of the videos I've linked up here in the spreadsheet. And they basically demonstrated this Detonate Dead build DS Lily on Blood Mage and Crit, non-crit based build version, and it kind of gave me the idea to potentially try and mold that build around some of the ideas I'd been carrying for a while. And this is the result. Before going into the details, I'll just quickly give a very objective pro and cons of the build before we go any further. Pros, as you saw in the video, I use that example because there is a non-crit hit there and a crit, which we can break down the numbers from a bit later. But ultimately, that was a difficulty 4 or tier 4 level Xesht, and can one-shot pretty much all the end-game content in the game. The build is extremely tanky, even though we don't run Energy Shield, which I'll explain later. Pretty much just face check everything. I think in that video as well, which we can open up a bit later, pretty much just take one of his abilities into the face. We can even show it here, his flick, and we live through it. It's coming up. Yeah, you can see there, pretty much took about half health. The rest is just me draining my own mana. Back to the spreadsheet. So one of the big appeals for me, at least personally, was I like to think of somewhat non-meta builds, and I find this build has a lot of very cool and interesting passive gear and ability interactions and synergies that really fit really nicely with the Infernalist. Detonate Dead, after spending so much time around using Spark, feels very satisfying to use. Just massive explosions, everything pretty much is getting one shot. It's a lot of fun. Although specializing in bosses, the build does work very well in high density maps and breaches in particular as well. There's a lot of gear variations and options. There's no real unique that's mandatory for the build. There are a lot of, a few pieces that I would highly recommend and work well, but they are by no means needed. The build fits in rarity really easily at the moment. Rarity is very, very meta at the moment, and it's silly not to run it. I do expect a nerf soon, but you can fit in rarity very easily. You can use the unique shield. Can't remember how you pronounce it, but that almost just gives you 200 rarity just off the bat. As I mentioned, with rarity being nerfed and other things, the build is, I dare say, maybe jinxing it, but relatively nerf safe. With GGG back from holidays, I do expect to see some news dropping soon, but as I mentioned, we don't use Energy Shield, we don't use Spark, we don't use any bugged or suspicious kind of suspect interactions. The only risk really is potentially a nerf to Archmage, but even if they nerf, cut that in half or even more, we're talking about hitting in the 20, 30 million range. You can't even scale it higher. So I dare say we're pretty safe. Like I said, I want to be objective, so I will call out the cons. Much like any minion or any build that centers around using minions, the minion pathing is horrendous at times. They get stuck in passages, doorways. Sometimes one massive peeve of mine, let's say if there's one thing that I don't like about this build at times is especially on lower density maps or bigger maps, I'd say. What sometimes happens is the minions will get stuck way behind you, just attacking one, straggling mob while you're trying to push through, and you have to either recall them or kill that one mob just to get them to keep running with you. There are ways to work around that a little bit, but that's definitely annoying. Mapping is slower than some of the other more efficient mapping orientated builds. This isn't your Temporalis zoomy zoom type build, so if you're really looking for something just to efficiently farm currency and whiz through maps, this isn't it. There is a little bit of gear and gem swapping when you transition between mapping and bossing, which could put some people off, but the way I've tried to set things up is to keep that very minimal. Pretty much you're just moving your scepter around from one weapon set to another and switching out a few gems, 3 or 4 to be specific. So there's nothing over the top, no respecking of passive nodes or anything like that, but there is definitely a little bit of work, I guess. As I touched upon, it's not cheap. To really reach the point where you can just kind of 1 or 2 tap the end game top tier bosses, you do need to invest a few, I'm probably looking at a minimum, I would say, of 40-50 divs. But that said, I have tested it on a 1 div version and it still clears all the T15, 16 maps and does all the lower level versions of the bosses, no problem. One thing which may put a few people off as well is, at least with the setup that I've got, it does feel like it could use a little bit of cast speed. The cast time can feel a little bit clunky at points, but that will really come down to the individual. And like I said, you could tweak the build to fit in a bit more cast speed to make it feel a bit smoother. Anyway, so what can the build achieve? We saw a bit of a highlight there. Then, as I said, I used this example quite specifically because it has a non-crit and a crit hit in it, so we can kind of work out some numbers. I do have the numbers here if you want to look ahead, but we'll dive into the video and we'll actually slow it down to really break it down. So wait here as the boss comes up, and we'll slow it right down to a quarter speed so we can just see everything. You have also a glimpse, which we'll come back to in a bit later, of the rotation, but watch the numbers up here. We'll see the first hit in a couple of seconds as I set everything up. Bang, so non-crit, we're talking about 5.5 million there, with all buffs applied. And then we follow it up with a crit, which was about 5.5. So we're talking about 26 million in one hit. And that is with shock having been dropped off after got pushed away. So probably, well, not probably, I have done the math here. Basically, like I said, non-crit, we're talking numbers of the range of about 5 million. Crit version there without shock, with the shock buff missing, was 25 million. We kind of extrapolate that out. I don't want to spend too much time boring you with mathematics here, but take my word for it. You can see the numbers here, cross-reference the spreadsheet. Pardon me. But shamelessly rounding up the numbers, just for the YouTube clicks, the math works out to be, we're talking about roughly 35 million crit in one hit, which, like I said, is, I think Xesht has 33 million or thereabouts. So, definitely one shot, and I have one-shotted him in the past. And that's, if you have a lot of money the currency. Yeah, you can get to even bigger numbers. I don't have. This is a new character which I power leveled up for a different video, which I kind of loaded back up and dumped the currency that I had on another character into. But I still don't have a level 20 gem, and I've probably got an easily accessible 4 or 5 more passive points as well. But that number could definitely grow. So how does the build work? Basically, we use Detonate Dead, as I said, casting our own minions. The way this works is through this spirit buff called Sacrifice. As you can see here, skills can use undead reviving minions in place of corpses. So typically Detonate Dead only works on corpses, but this allows you to cast it on your own minions. And Detonate Dead, most importantly here, is the key line. Here deals physical damage equal to 20% of the corpse's maximum life, or in this case, the minion's maximum life. So, scaling off minion health, we use minions, especially brutes in this case, with the most health to really get that one-shot potential on bosses. During mapping though, however, we use the minions basically as the initiator to just get a few corpses and kills on the ground, and then we can just use Detonate Dead normally on the corpses from the mobs that we kill, even ideally, so we save our minions for when we need them. We then have, for the bosses especially, quite a few complementary skills to further enhance the damage, and then the cream on top, we add crit, which synergizes well, as I said, with the Infernalist, well, one of the Infernalist ascendancy nodes, to really push those numbers up to crazy levels. You could see earlier, non-crit 5 million, and then almost 6 times the amount of damage, if not more. One very quick call out regarding the Detonate Dead gem. You can see here the level is specifically and deliberately left at level 7. The reason for this is, as you level up Detonate Dead, the only thing that changes is this fire damage, which we're not scaling at all. We're scaling purely off the second part, which is the physical damage from the minion life or corpse life. So there is absolutely no benefit in leveling this gem. All you're going to be doing is incurring more mana cost, because the mana cost is going to scale with the level of the gem. And running Archmage, you don't want to do that. So very importantly, leave Detonate Dead at level 7, which is the lowest level it can be. So playstyle. We'll have a very quick look here at the rotation used for bossing, and we'll even deliberately leave it at a quarter speed so we can really break it down. But what we're going to be using, just to kind of look ahead, is 4 extra abilities, that being a bit easier to see here in game: Soul Offering, Eye of Winter, Ball Lightning, and Mana Tempest. And the order in which we use those: put down our Soul Offering on one of our own minions, we throw Ball Lightning, which applies shock and exposure. We then follow up with a Eye of Winter. You could arguably do those in either order, probably even better to do Eye of Winter first. That applies critical weakness, which increases our crit chance. We then throw a Mana Tempest on ourselves, and finally cast Detonate Dead. Normally we hopefully wouldn't get interrupted, but then we follow up with more Detonate Dead, and we finish him off. So that's the rotation for bossing. Specifically, the support gems we then use for Detonate Dead are very much focused around single target and just maximizing damage without worrying about the area effect. So the support gems we actually run, hopefully this is the setup that I've got at the moment, it is. We've got Spell Echo, which basically just doubles up the cast. Think of it pretty much as a 2-time damage. We've got Minion Pact, which sacrifices a bit of our minion health, which we don't care about since we're sacrificing them anyway. To do 40% more damage. Considered Casting, again 40% more damage. Elemental Focus, we're not using Detonate Dead in our setup to apply shock or anything like that. We're doing that with Ball Lightning, much more efficient. So we can use Elemental Focus for 25% more damage. And we use Consecrated Effect for, again, 40% more damage. So you can see big numbers there. We covered the rotation. The minions we use as well are Brutes and Clerics. I play it by ear. I tend to like to run a kind of 2 to 1 ratio of minions that I'm sacrificing in Clerics. The reason we use Clerics, which I'll dive into later, but I'll quickly cover, is they basically keep your other minions alive and revive them periodically. So just gives you better damage sustain, especially while you're mapping. A bit less important in bossing, but it is handy having them as a backup, and you tend to not need more than 1 or 2 brutes to kill the boss anyway. Mapping, on the other hand, which I'll give a very quick showcase of. Speed this back up. Is a lot more simple. We really don't care about any complementary abilities. We are basically just spamming Detonate Dead. And as you can see here, the detonations are happening all over the place, and that is basically due to our support gems, which focus very much about increasing the area of effect, as well as basically just, well, I'll dive into the supports, which will explain a little better. So in place of Considered Casting, Elemental Focus, and Concentrated Effect, would typically take those 3 out and would run these, which are Corpse Conservation. Basically gives a 25% chance of the minion not dying when we detonate it, so better sustain during mapping. Has 40% larger area of effect on Magnified Effect, and Spell Cascade, which gives that basically creates a detonation on either side of the place where you cast. Maybe we can show that a bit better in game. You can see the echo and the different cascades firing off. It really just covers the screen really well. Anyway. In terms of the mapping, however, you can still use the Soul Offering, Eye of Winter, Ball Lightning, Mana Tempest, or a combination based on however much damage you need during the actual map bosses. Personally, even the damage, just simply using Detonate Dead by itself on map bosses, even at difficulty level 4, is you just maybe need 1 or 2 extra casts and they fall pretty quick. One other change that we do during mapping is we use warriors, and that is simply because if we swap out our brutes, is we can use a lot more minions, which again just comes back to having a bit more sustain during mapping, and always a bit easier to have a guaranteed minion where you need it. And the health and the damage from the lower health skeletal warriors is more than enough to one-shot everything as well. In terms of gear passive swapping, you can actually see, I kind of did a demo there of the gems that I swap out. The other thing I do when I do change, I'll go into gearing a bit later, but I run a different focus versus shield, mapping versus bossing. One is more damage orientated, the other one is more rarity, magic find orientated. And the way I set it up is basically I just need to move the scepter in between the two weapon sets, just change one between the other. And I have a few passive node tweaks, I think just 5 points in the different weapon sets to, again, just swap a few things around. But we can dive into that a bit later. In terms of passives and gearing, just before I do a deep dive, roughly in order of priority, some of the things you will be focusing on. Someone else can handle that later. Things you want to be focusing on is, firstly, roughly in order of priority, as with any build, solve your resistances. Resistances are very important in PoE 2. One shout out in terms of the resistances though is you want to have enough to support 90 fire res, which we'll dive into later again, but 70 plus in the others is typically fine, and we don't need chaos due to chaos inoculation, which we run. We stack mana, this is more HP and more damage. We stack spirit, more spirit is more minions, smooths out the whole experience, especially during mapping. More spirit also with a unique focus that we run is more damage. Again, I'll dive into the details. This is just a very quick snapshot. Stack minion health, stack other damage sources, spell damage, crit obviously. We stack ES on our gear because we convert that to mana, so more mana again is more HP, more damage. And optionally, well, not really optional at the moment, it'd be silly not to run it, is rarity. This could be technically almost the most important thing, but again, I'm hoping this gets nerfed sometime soon, and the build does fit it quite easily. So, time to do a deep dive. Rather than just kind of giving a very quick look at the passive tree and all my gear, I want to take a slightly different approach here and just break down all the different components of the build and try and really highlight some of the synergies between some of the keystone passives we take and gearing choices and how everything ties in together. Hope you like this approach. We'll see how it goes. So anyway, focusing first on damage. So we scale our damage in a number of ways. This isn't necessarily in order of significance, although it kind of roughly is. Firstly, we have minion health. There are a number of ways to scale this. First and foremost, and quite significantly in fact, is simply the level of the gem. So by upgrading your using your uncut gems and upgrading the ability at its base level, every single level gives a bump up in the life. Obviously then we have our support gems as well, which impact that. We've got meat shield, 50% more maximum life, and again bumping up the level of the gem. Common theme here is then again on gear, anything that gives plus levels to minion skills or spells in general will bump up the level of the gem and in turn bump up the level amount of maximum life. Remember, Detonate Dead converts 20% of that maximum life into base damage. So we're talking big numbers here. So just simply the Skeletal Warrior by itself, if we take the base value there, we're talking up 7.23 thousand damage base. So if you compare that to something like, I don't know, you know, some of the numbers that you see on other skills. You know, Ball Lightning is the best example, but it's significant. Other places where we find minion health, you'll get a bit of a sneak peek at the full passive tree here, but some particular nodes that I want to highlight. Any node that has minions have increased maximum life, you want to be picking up if it's within the vicinity of where you're pathing. So we have a few nodes down here, these two here. We've got a few good ones here. There we go, 40% there. This cluster here, this small cluster there. I think that's all of them. The other way to bump it up is a covered passive, support gems, plus level of the gem itself, jewels. So rubies synergize very well with this build. I'll cover some of the other roles here. These aren't necessarily perfect by any stretch because jewels can get quite expensive, but one key line here I want to point out is the minions have increased maximum life. This rolls, I think, up to 15. Yep. So that's one thing you want to be looking for on your rubies. I've been debating between using the rubies, a bit of a side topic here, between using rubies with minion health and fire res versus using more crit orientated sapphires. However, the maximum fire res is very handy from a survivability point of view, which I'll dive into later. So I do gravitate towards ruby, and I haven't run the math or done any testing, but I do suspect the maximum life, considering it works, you know, manipulates the base value of the ability, scales a bit better than other sources of damage. Second way we're increasing our damage is through stacking mana. Archmage, everyone should know what Archmage is, but for those that don't, basically for each 100 max mana, you get 8% lightning damage. With the mana that I'm currently running, 5.3k, for instance, here in this mapping setup, should actually tell me here, we're talking about 4 times extra on top. So, you know, you're talking 5 times the damage that you normally do, simply by toggling this on. Mana can be found pretty much anywhere on your gear. Pretty much, it's one of the main things beyond levels to minion skills that I almost look for on any piece. We're really looking for numbers upwards of 150 plus, almost everywhere. Some key places where items of gear where you can see percentage-based increases in maximum mana is on your amulet. So the maximum roll here is that you can get is 12%. This is with the quality upgraded through the breach items. You can get maximum mana through your soul cores. Getting breach rings with the extra max quality can really scale your mana high. You can see, for instance, here I've got 262 and 280. I believe they can get upwards of 300 plus. I can't remember what the maximum is, but big numbers. And that's it. Bit of a look ahead into the gearing, and then you can also then use those breach rings in combination with ingenuity, the belt, to really maximize those big rolls. Intelligence also converts to mana, so if you can, getting the high intelligence rolls as well. More mana, more damage for your Archmage. Also more mana, more defense, more life pool through Mind Over Matter. Next, spell damage. Again, you can find this on gear. So where do I have? I think I have a roll here somewhere. anywhere you can see spell damage. I believe you can get the spell damage on in various places. I think on rings and amulets potentially. If I don't know, can't remember the specifics. But basically, any roll related to lightning spell damage, as you saw, Archmage provides the bulk of our damage, and it is lightning based. So lightning spell damage is good. Elemental damage, spell damage, again, lightning is elemental, and just your generic spell damage. Spirit has a twofold effect in terms of increasing your damage. More minions basically means more sources of detonation, so it's not really bumping up your singular numbers, but it is providing you with more detonations. But gearing wise, if you run this unique focus threaded light, you can see that line at the bottom, 14% increased spell damage per 10 spirit. The max roll here on a corrupted version of this is 15, I believe, and at the moment we are running, if I put my scepter on, almost 400 spirit in the current gear that I have. So 400 times 14, that's a lot of spell damage. Another place where you can get, so the main sources that you can get for spirit are your scepter being the main one. It's 199 just purely off this scepter alone. Note that bumping up the quality of the scepter will increase the spirit, so make sure to max that out. You can get spirit on your amulet. Chest pieces, I'm currently wearing warriors, specifically with 10 spirit per socketed rune or soul core. So with 5 of those, that's 50 spirit through this. Likewise, if you just run a normal rare chest, I believe that can also roll up to 60 spirit. And lastly, you can also get spirit on a corrupted version of a helmet, although I believe that's quite rare and potentially quite expensive as well. But that's your sources of spirit. Lastly, crit. We primarily run the crit to focus on bossing. As I said, you don't need it for mapping at all, but to really reach that true one-shot potential for the endgame bosses at the top tier, the crit is what takes it to the another level. Just for example's sake, you can see here on my Detonate Dead, I am running almost 500% critical damage bonus. So, pretty big. So, in terms of finding crit, there are rings, amulets, focus, and gloves on gear. I've been a bit lax on this front. It was hard to find anything within my price point with those, with the rolls that I needed. So I've missed out a little bit there, but they are your sources. In terms of this passive tree, there's plenty of places that have clusters that focus on crit. We've got this cluster down here, which we pass through. This here. This one over here. And then for added effect, I highly recommend running, if you can afford it, a time lost sapphire in this place with specifically increased effect of small passive skills and also the critical damage bonus for notables. So we've got 1, 2, 3 notables here. Also managed to snag a jewel with increased spell damage as well for the small passive. So getting good value out of this one time lost sapphire here. Other places where we can find crit within our path is a good cluster here. One thing to really just remember to call out here is a bit more of a defensive related point, but these two notable nodes here also have added defensive benefits. So we got 25% reduced critical damage bonus against you here, as well as 25% reduced critical hit chance against you. So that's also very handy to avoid getting those one-shot bursts of damage against you. We've also got a very high value cluster of crit nodes down here, as well as some over here. So you can see the reasons why we've paths in these various directions, and they all happen to be around the keystone passives that we need. So we've got the Mind Over Matter here, Eldritch Battery, and Chaos Inoculation, which I mentioned earlier. In terms of crit, I'll dive into the reasons why again a bit later, but crit spell damage bonus is what you really want in terms of seeing the big numbers, because it scales with one of our ascendancy nodes. However, crit chance is still equally important in terms of smoothing out the experience. Unlike a blood mage, which increases the base critical chance of our abilities, we do need some crit chance to really smooth out the experience. Otherwise, you're relying quite a bit on luck, especially in terms of bossing. If you're dropping anywhere below about 20% crit, we do bump it up with critical weakness and other means a little bit. But if you don't want to be sitting there trying to cast 5 or 6 minion detonations to try and one-shot the boss, well, you're no longer one-shotting him. So that pretty much covers it in terms of damage sources. Defensively, as I mentioned, the build is surprisingly very, very tanky. Well, maybe not surprisingly, because it's deliberately why I've set it up the way I have. In terms of your defensive layers, firstly, standard with all builds, mentioned this earlier, resistances, max them out. We want to hit fire res at 90%. Again, dive into the details in a moment. Next, mana, Mind Over Matter. All damage taken is taken from mana before life. We don't run any life or energy shields, so we do need that node. More mana, the more you stack mana, the more your effective life pool is. Also, starting to talk about synergies. This is where you see the synergy also with Archmage. So by stacking a singular stat, we're getting big benefits to our damage as well as our defense. We don't run. The reason why you see just one here is because of Eldritch Battery, which converts our energy shield to mana. Again, we do this so we get more mana, which is more damage and a bigger life pool. And we run Chaos Inoculation, which bumps our max life down to 1. And this is so that we get Chaos Immunity, which I'll touch on later. So, wait a second. Why don't we run Energy Shield? Obviously, Energy Shield is very overpowered at the moment. Many builds basically build around it. It's very easy to scale. So, there's one primary reason being Grinning Emulation, which we'll start diving into our ascendancy nodes now. Grinning Emulation gives us a big boost in critical damage bonus, that 30% roughly with the setup that I've got, which is not optimal by any stretch. As I mentioned, I've missed out on a fair few rolls on gear. We're talking, I think, in the vicinity of 100 and I think 100 plus crit damage bonus. I think it's about 150 or thereabouts. The downside of this node, however, is you self-ignite every time you crit, doing 15% of your life in energy shield. So other builds that the Infernalists that you see Infernalists running, especially in combination with Pyropact, is what they'll do is they'll stack things like they'll use Zealots, or how you pronounce it, Zealots Ophir, which uses life regen to regenerate energy shield in combination with Eternal Youth, which allows you to use your flask on energy shield. And they'll basically sit there eating up their energy shield while regenerating it and using flasks and basically just absorbing the damage from these two nodes in combination with, can't remember what the spirit or a barrier invocation, I believe it is. There's a spirit ability which, when you take energy shield damage, it basically allows you to cast abilities. You'll see Comet spam builds centered around that. But that's a different build. I didn't want to mess around with dealing with those two nodes and managing my energy shield around grinning emulation. It's not the point of this build. And if you do the math, the way this synergizes with Eldritch Battery and Chaos Inoculation is by having one life, we completely abolish that downside of grinning immolation because 15% of one is basically nothing. Well, I don't know how they do the rounding, but it has absolutely no effect on you basically. So you're just getting that 30% critical damage bonus for free. Well, not for free, by deliberately building around it. So that's why we don't run Energy Shield. We don't want to have that downside to manage. So we just want to keep things simple. Secondary reason is, well, even without Energy Shield, running with 5,000 plus mana, plus some of the other defensive layers that we've got, which I'll touch upon in a moment. Basically, at least in my personal experience, I think I've died once, and that's simply because my minions got stuck well behind me and I face check a whole bunch of hasted mobs and a rare, and just basically just laziness on my part. I think that's the one time I've died in mapping. Even a lot of on-ground effects without dying. So don't feel I really need it. More reasons is, again, using Eldritch Battery and not needing to use things like Everlasting Gaze, or I believe there's a helmet which also converts some of your mana back into Energy Shield. By freeing up our amulet and gear slots to just really focus on mana, we can scale mana higher without having to worry about Energy Shield, which again means more damage for your Archmage and more HP pool the way we're working around it. Again, a reminder, our primary goal really around this build is to have some fun around one-shotting endgame bosses. So it's not about stacking 20,000 health and, running a hardcore type build. Bonus little reason as well for not running Energy Shield is, well, it's nerf proof. Many people suspect Energy Shield will get hit by the nerf bat. It's very overpowered at the moment, whether it's Energy Shield or just Grim Feast, which provides the overflow. I do suspect there'll be a nerf incoming, or at least something. So keeps us safe from that. Bit of a bonus. Next defensive layer, mana recovery. Obviously by focusing our life around our mana pool, any way to regenerate mana serves as an extra defensive layer. We don't actually, I do have a point in the spreadsheet I think later on, but it's worth touching on. I don't actually focus at mana regen anywhere within our passive tree except for these connecting nodes up here. I did run Ether Flow for a while, as well as I believe some other clusters elsewhere. However, with the slow cast speed of Detonate Dead, I didn't really feel the need for it. So I use those passive nodes to just boost damage basically. Again, one-shotting bosses is the primary goal. And during mapping, I just didn't feel effect. Coming from using Spark, which just saps your mana hard with Archmage, just didn't seem to face the same problem with Detonate Dead. The other reason for that maybe is I did manage to pick up relatively high rolls of mana regen on my gear here. I think I've got it in a few other places. Or is it just on the rings? I think it's just on the rings, but even with on the rings, 58% there, 64, and then the 80% increase effect from Ingenuity. You get quite a bit of regen there. You can see the actual value. I've almost got 10% mana per second, just under. And that seems to be enough. You can even see if I just run around here, detonating minions non-stop, the mana doesn't dip below max very much at all. So I don't really feel a problem. Next defensive layer, and one of the key reasons I was trying to build around Grinning Immolation, as well as this combination of Eldritch Battery and mana stacking, is also about being able to pick up Chaos Inoculation. Stacking Chaos Resistance is a bit of a pain at the moment, and this just completely removes that need and just makes you completely immune to chaos damage. So really, really like this one. And obviously gives you a ton of survivability because the end game does have plenty of sources of chaos damage. Downside of the node itself, or the way that it is obviously reducing our HP to 1. But as I mentioned, that synergy with Grinning Immolation, that reduction actually serves as a benefit in our case. So what typically is a downside is a win for us. So it's just a win-win for this node. Another small minor bonus actually with Chaos Inoculation and only having 1 HP is this support gem. It's pretty negligible, but worth highlighting is, removes 100% of your max life from a minion to actually do the extra damage. And well, we only have 1 HP, so we're not sacrificing any minion health to get that bonus damage. Obviously, we're sacrificing the minions to begin with, so we don't really worry, but it makes your minions survive a little bit longer. So smooths that experience out as well. Another big synergy or reason for running Chaos Inoculation is now the pairing with the other Ascendancy node that's we build around it, which is Altered Flesh. Altered Flesh is this node here, which does a whole bunch of damage taken conversions. You can almost group these into two. Your elemental damages converted to fire and physical damage converted to chaos. So that physical damage, since we're immune to chaos damage, means that Altered Flesh in combination with Chaos Inoculation gives us just a full 20% physical damage reduction, which is very, very handy for any caster since we don't run any armor at all. Not that armor's great, but 20% free physical damage reduction with Altered Flesh in combination with Chaos Inoculation. The other part with the elemental cold and lightning converted to fire, this is the reason I've mentioned I think 2 or 3 times already. We want to try and stack or bump up our max fire resist to 90, which is the hard cap. I think currently at the moment I am sitting on 84. So not only are we definitely getting physical damage reduction through this, by also only needing to stack 1 elemental max resist, which is fire in this case, we're also getting a big reduction in our cold and lightning damage taken. So if you think of this in terms of if we can reach 90% here, that 20% conversion gets reduced to basically 2% damage taken from cold and lightning. The place where, I'll quickly touch upon, the place where we do get that max resist highlighted earlier is through our jewels. I find that the easiest way and just really synergizes well with how this whole build is put together. We're building around max life, and rubies happen to have the max fire resist on roll on it as well. So I think every gem that dual that I could. I've got some cheaper rolls here, but I think most of them are 2% max fire res and minion increased life. And the other roll I try and get here just while we're on this subject is the elemental damage. They're the three key, the best rolls that you get. So as I said, I'm missing 1% here. If I have more passive points, there's some other dual slots that are easily accessible here and here. So 2 more, so 1 plus 4 more there gives us 5. So I'll be almost hitting 9%. Should be get to 89%. So as I mentioned, rather than, I don't think many people, I don't know if there are any builds that really work around trying to max out elemental max caps, but instead of having to focus on 3 elements, we just have to focus on the one being fire, which is easy, as I said, through the rubies. Now, as you can see, we keep having more defensive layers, which you can start to see why the build is as tanky as it is. Now we also have our Infernal Hound, so not taking chaos damage. We're reducing our physical damage through Altered Flesh. We're stacking our fire res, which is effectively lowering our full elemental damage reduction. Now we also pick up Loyal Hellhound, which gives us an Infernal Hound. And again here we now get 20% of damage from hits. Taken is taken by Hellhound instead. Typically in most builds that you see, except for completely minion focused builds, is most people pick this node up, but then say it's almost useless because the Hellhound just dies straight away. But this comes down to one of those synergies again, because we're stacking minion max life for our damage through Detonate Dead. It also beefs this guy up to levels where, coupled with your clerics as well, which heal your minions, this guy, I don't think I've seen him die at all in any of my playthroughs in mapping or bossing in the last day or two. So you can see here he's got 23k life in this setup right now. So, lots of armor, resistances as well. So lastly, minions don't directly affect your damage mitigation at all, but as with any minion build, minions do act as meat shields. This can be a bit inconsistent. Some enemies just beeline straight past them and go for you anyway, but quite often than not, especially in mapping, you're taking less hits because they're taking them. The only thing you're really looking out for in mapping is, ground effects, which I swear I've eaten quite a few and I have no issues with anyway. So a lot of talking, I apologize, but like I said, did warn you, I do like to dive deep and really explain everything. Just a very quick recap or a summary. So basically running Mind Over Matter with Archmage, that synergy means we just, simply by stacking mana, we're bumping both our life pool and our damage. Eldritch Battery combined with the above means stacking Energy Shield gives us more mana, which again gives us more life and damage. Chaos Inoculation plus Eldritch Battery plus Greening Emulation we just talked about. By actually reducing our HP and ES to 1, we completely avoid downside of Greening Emulation. Again, Chaos Inoculation plus Altered Flesh, the other Ascendancy node, means we get the full 20% physical damage reduction. And finally, by stacking minion health for our damage, we also sustain our Hellhound, which gives us 20% more damage reduction. So a lot of synergies all around, and it's exactly what makes a build feel like it actually works for the Infernalist Ascendancy, and actually makes it feel good to play. So just a quick recap as well, the passive tree, I've pretty much covered all the nodes. The other only ones to really highlight, like I talked about, most of it focuses around minion max life, crit, and a bit of mana, spell damage orientated nodes here. The only other real call outs are picking up a bit of lightning penetration, basically purely for the bossing side of things. Other clusters that are very useful are this one here, which, along with the support gem that we ran that I touched upon earlier, reduces our chance of actually consuming a minion on the detonation. So I believe we've got 25% here, plus the gem is another 25%, so 50% chance not to consume a minion when you cast Detonate Dead. Few nodes that we run here while mapping is just quicker revival on the odd chance that those minions do all die. It's very rare, but it does happen, so it's nice. Arguably, you could skip these 3 points here. I've got it on a weapon set swap, so it's a bit hard to see. One important note which I haven't touched upon yet, and I dare say almost mandatory for mapping, is Relentless Fallen here, which basically just gives it, particularly for the movement speed for your minions. I will stress the minion pathing is the one big downside of this build, and this alleviates it a little bit. And that's pretty much it in terms of the passive tree. One thing I haven't touched upon is your enchantment on your amulet. What I have decided to take is this node here. There's probably plenty of other options if you can think of, but personally it's just the biggest bang for buck in terms of critical damage bonus. I don't really lack for anything else, so it's just purely increase that one-shot potential for bossing. Bit of a downside in terms of crit hit chance, but it's doesn't outweigh the damage bonus. One quick thing, I'll jump ahead and take a bit of a sidetrack from the spreadsheet. One little tip to help in terms of the minion pathing, since we touched upon it earlier, is to use your, can't remember what the input is called. I'll quickly look it up here. Direct minions. So I've got it set to spacebar because I've got my dodge on shift from other games that I've played. But what that allows me, basically, if you have it bound to an easily accessible key, which you can just hold down while you're using WASD or your mouse, is you can basically hold down space, in my case, or whatever you choose to be, and if you hold it down, the minions will basically go to wherever you're targeting, which will basically make them be in front of you as you're moving along, rather than, if I can demonstrate if they can actually move off that spot now, rather than trailing behind you. So typically as you're running through a map, they'll kind of trail behind you. The AI sometimes is good and they'll run ahead, but standard behavior is to lag behind you a little bit. However, if I hold down space and then run, you can now see, keeps them in front of you a little bit easier. Gear wise, I'll quickly highlight my gear specifically. I've moused over most of the pieces, but just for another quick reference. Your scepter, key things you're looking for here is, they say the two mandatory ones are increased spirit and all level to all minions. Big bonuses are obviously minion max life. This can roll quite high, I think, believe at 50. I've managed to actually get a decent roll here with a little bit of intelligence and mana, but not the best scepter by any stretch. And the other thing you may, not super critical, but helps, is to get an Omen scepter for the Malice. What Malice does is it provides another way of applying critical weakness to increase your crit chance, especially for bosses. Just helps bump that up quicker in combination with Eye of Winter. Other good rolls on your scepter, I believe, increase, especially if you're running Malice, is there's a roll around increasing your presence radius, so it's easier to apply Malice. Ideally, you want to get a +5 roll for the minion skills here. One common trend you'll see, like as I classified the build at the very beginning of the video, a bit of an upper mid-tier level build. One little tip for when you're trying to buy pieces and you don't want to spend exorbitant amounts of currency, I equate it to, or compare it to, buying like PC parts for anyone that's builds their own PCs out there. If you go for the very top end, latest, greatest items, you'll be paying 4 or 5 times the amount than one rung below it. So sometimes what you'll see is if you, rather than going for plus $5, you go plus 4, you see significant drops in how much items cost. Prime example of that is like things like Ingenuity, simply by not getting the 80% Maxroll. Obviously there's corrupted versions which go up to almost 100, which are just crazy amounts in terms of how much they cost. But if you just compare the top normal roll of 80 compared to 78, you're talking about, I think, at least a day ago, it was something like 10 or 15 div price difference, and you're talking about 2%. So a lot of ways to save money is just by simply getting a slightly lower rolled stat. So Shredded Light, I think, was another example. 15% is the max roll. I got a 14 and it was like a third of the price. You see a common trend with that. So Scepter, your helm, again, key thing you're looking for on pretty much all pieces beyond the Scepter is maximum mana and plus levels where you can get it. So that's on the amulet and on the helm. I personally run Warriors. I just find this synergizes really well and it's not too expensive. I believe the Spirit max mana combination is, don't quote me on this, around the 10 div mark, maybe a bit even less. I think it may have been 6 or 7. So actually, not too expensive in the whole scheme of things. The most expensive piece I believe here was the Ingenuity. I think this was about 30 odd div. I got actually quite lucky and found a corrupted version basically listed for the same price as other 78% rolls with the max fire res, which, as we've mentioned a few times now, I actually really want. So that was kind of handy. Gloves were just a item I actually found and crafted a little bit, so I was quite lucky in terms of the rolls here. Like really handy. You got high rarity roll, high resistance rolls, max mana. Boots really want movement speed. Stress really want movement speed. I'll probably say minimum 25%. 30 roll, again, max mana, intelligence, more mana, high res rolls. Your breach rings, the main thing you're looking for, or at least works well with the max quality on, is mana in combination with mana regen. Both of those get scaled up with the quality. All elemental resist is nice. You can, I believe, get, as I said, crit spell damage or chance, one of the two, can't remember which. So also solving your resistances. One thing to highlight is, I think I've got all attributes on my amulet here, but keep in mind Warriors Invictus does have a strength and dex requirement of a bit over 50. So if you can pick up an all attributes roll on one of these breach rings in combination with Ingenuity, it will solve a lot of your problems. Otherwise, what you're going to have to do, which I've had to, you're going to have to spec quite a few points in your passive tree, which is missed opportunity for intelligence, which is, again, more mana. So that's a bit of a lack of optimization on my part, a bit of oversight. And that pretty much, I think, covers it. As I mentioned, Shredded Light. One thing, as I mentioned, for mapping, I personally run this shield. I think any Magic Fine rarity orientated build runs this. This is quite a cheap one. Didn't want to spend exorbitant amounts on the corrupted 3-socket version, but big high 660% roll gives you good value anyway. That's what 20% times, so you're getting 150 almost rarity just purely from this one item in itself. I mentioned about manage regen and not really needing it too much. Quick comparisons to Blood Mage. As I touched upon, credit to DS Lily, I believe was one of the first people that highlighted this build on her Blood Mage. Just running a few comparisons here. Bit incomplete here, so I'll go a bit off cuff. But one of the key nodes in terms of the Blood Mage, in terms of crit scaling, is their ability to scale crit damage off of life. I believe it's 1 or 2% off for 40 max life, but effectively equate, if you're talking about a HP pool of around 3,000 or 4, I think 4 stretching about 3,000, you're talking about in the range of 60 to 100% crit damage bonus from that Blood Mage node. As I mentioned, we get, I dare say, almost twice as much from Grinning Immolation, being the 30%. So that's a bit of a win for the Infernalist over the Blood Mage. However, trying to be objective, the Blood Mage has a big benefit of increasing the base critical chance of abilities, and it's almost double, so it's quite significant. So they have a much smoother, less luck orientated time with bosses due to that. But the best way to summarize it really is the overall damage probably, I dare say, roughly evens out between the two. You're talking more top end one-shot potential on this Infernalist build, while the Blood Mage has a bit more consistency. However, maybe a bit biased, but I feel that the Infernalist is actually better suited for this Detonate crit build because the survivability from Altered Flesh, the Hound, being able to run Chaos Inoculation, it just feels so good. Like, as I said, you just face check basically everything. Also, unlike the Blood Mage, you don't have to worry about managing your life and regening and all the other downsides that come with Sagomancy, or however you pronounce it, on the Blood Mage tree. Few points to wrap up on. Worth highlighting the further scaling abilities or the potential of the build. If you are absolutely swimming in currency, there's crazy things you can do with the Adorned jewel in combination with blue jewels. It's just super expensive though, but you can do crazy things. There's also some bugged tech between Adorned and time lost jewels, which, just some crazy stuff around that. I'm missing the top end of the Ingenuity belt roll, so there's some big scaling there. Again, super expensive though. Could pick up a Dream Fragments unique ring in one of the slots that provides, I think, a corrupted version upwards of 24% maximum mana. I think the base is 20. Again, in combination with Ingenuity, just massive scaling to your mana. Although, again, these are very expensive. You're talking, I think, 70 divs plus. I'm missing a +1 on the minion levels on the Scepter, another +1 on the Amulet. As I said, missed out on some crit damage on the Breach rings. So there's more potential there. Also, could get higher mana in int rolls. For your rarity, you could get another socket on the shield, another 1% from Thread of Light. I'm also tempted to potentially explore, rather than using Thread of Light I can't do the math on the top of my head, but whether picking up a actual like real chunky focus with plus level 2 skills, you can get, I think, upwards of 300 plus energy shield, which converts to mana, plus a high mana roll, plus spell damage. There's some really good stats you can get on a focus, so I'm curious to see and potentially picking up a focus and testing that in comparison to Threaded Light. However, Threaded Light is a relatively inexpensive option, which syncs well with... Why won't it let me change the weapon set? Threaded Light just synergizes so well with the fact that we're stacking Spirit anyway, and it's, like I said, pretty inexpensive. Video's dragging on a bit long, so I won't dive into this. I was meaning to. Maybe it'll be a potential for a future video. However, I did put together, like I said, a version which ended up costing, I believe, about 80 Exalted Orbs, which cleared T15, level 80, 81 maps without any problem, was running around 4k mana. So it is possible. Topic for another day though. Also, I was meaning to do some trade tips, searching tips as well, but again, we're running over. Anyway, that about wraps it up. Long video, I know, but hopefully you found it informative. I do have a Maxroll guide and the spreadsheet available, which I'll make public and link to the video. And I hope people got something out of this and enjoyed it. If you have, please leave, and you've got to this point, please leave a like and subscribe. And all the best. I'll just leave you a bit of a video for a minute or two of showcasing the build and how it runs through a breach type scenario on the way to the end boss, and also we'll highlight the slight gear swap and gem swap that I do before the boss, so it gives a nice well-rounded showcase of the build. Well, ciao and all the best.
It's about time.